Hello, everybody. Welcome to Buddhism in a nutshell. I'm going to be talking today about the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are some of the oldest teachings that we have from the Buddha, supposed to be, in fact, one of the first teachings that he gave after becoming enlightened. So these are documented in a compilation of scriptures called the Pali Canon, and the Pali Canon are supposed to be the authentic teachings of the Buddha as he spoke them directly after his enlightenment. Now, if you're a historian or a theologian, a student of religion, it's helpful to note that the teachings of the Buddha were probably not written down until several hundred years after he died. And the consensus is that they were passed on orally through chants and prayers and the community of practitioners surrounding the Buddha orally for, like I said, 300 or 400 years. So we have to keep in mind that it is possible that these are not authentically exactly how the Buddha spoke these words. On the other hand, it's also helpful to keep in mind that due to the nature of these Buddhist communities, which I have visited several of here in the United States, of course these are more modernized, Americanized versions of this, but they are extremely ritualistic, extremely attentive to details. And I wouldn't be surprised if the teachings had been transmitted without any errors for 400 years. If you go visit a Zen center, for example, they do very specific chants. They ring the bell 108 times, and they just count it by hand. These people are very, very detail oriented. In fact, I suspect that the people who carry on these kinds of traditions probably tend towards obsessive compulsive. So we're talking about extreme attention to detail. I've heard of people memorizing the Quran or memorizing the Bible or memorizing these scriptures that are like 100,000 lines. And so, like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if they were transmitted authentically over that 400-year period where they were not written down. Anyways, this is all a preamble. I just wanted to tell you that the Four Noble Truths are the 500 BC equivalent of the self-help industry. Basically, these are teachings about psychology and human nature. And my opinion is that although they are from an ancient culture, 500 or 600 BC, ancient India, what does that have to do with us? But I believe that the Buddha was transmitting something that was true to human natures in all periods and all times. So that's why I'm talking about it now. I've found the teachings to be helpful in my own life as kind of a framework within which to operate, especially towards self-help and healing and compassion and the path of growth. So I've found these useful. That's basically why I am using my own voice as a transmission of these. I would probably say that I tend towards things like I'm fundamentally a scientist. I think I always wonder, is this really true? I'm very much a skeptic. I'm very much a scientist. I'm very much see for yourself, and I like evidence and I like proof. And so I would say the evidence and the proof for this is basically you have to live these things out in your life and see if they work. There's no other way to prove statements of this kind, existential statements like this, without actually living them for yourself and seeing. A close second would be find someone whom you trust who believes these things very dearly and see how that plays itself out in their lives. So if you don't want to really get into the meat of this stuff, you can still kind of take it in theoretically and observe how it affects other people if you want to really just be an objective observer in this stuff. So I am taking a step beyond science, and I'm saying, like, I've actually tried this stuff, and it seems to work. It seems to check out for me, and it's been around for 2,600 years. So maybe it's not complete bullshit. Maybe it is. You'll have to see for yourself. Okay, so the Four Noble Truths. Like I said, the Four Noble Truths generally just provide a framework for growth and spiritual development. So what are the Four Noble Truths? I'm going to talk about the first two first. Like, the first two kind of go together, and then the second two kind of goes together. So the first two are about suffering and the cause of suffering. So the first noble truth is called dukkha. And the way the Buddha put it was just, now I give you, or now I present to you the truth of dukkha. And dukkha is translated into English as suffering or unsatisfactoriness. Yeah, suffering, unsatisfactoriness, uneasiness, unhappiness, something like this. So first noble truth is life is suffering, or life is painful. The hip-hop artist Nas says it very well when he says life's a bitch and then you die. The Buddhists would take that even further and say life's a bitch and then you die, but that's not the end, because you're going to get reborn and you're going to have to, suffer through that whole cycle again. So the goal for the Buddhists is to eliminate the suffering now in this life, so that, if you believe in this reincarnation thing, that your future incarnations or someone else's future incarnations include less suffering than is in your life now. But for us, Americans, scientists, we can just say that life is suffering, right? Life's a bitch. Life sucks. The psychologist Jordan Peterson at University of Toronto, who I've been following for many years now, not so much his political stuff, but his older lectures on like the mythological and the psychological and the philosophical, really profound stuff, really changed my life. And he talks about Buddhism, although I think he's come up with this concept that he didn't know was related to Buddhism, but it sums up the first noble truth very perfectly. And I'm going to put the diagram on the screen now. This is his diagram of Peterson thinks that this structure sums up very nicely all mythological structures, narrative structures. So the idea is that your life can be conceptualized as a story, as a narrative, as a narrative. And where you are in the narrative is always the unbearable present. And this is dukkha. This is something is unsatisfactory, right? So we have the unbearable present, and then we always have a goal. We're always trying to get somewhere, and by the nature of goals, we're usually trying to get somewhere better. So right now, we're stuck in the unbearable present, and we're trying to escape into the ideal future. And then we have certain action plans that will take us there, and then we are either successful, we get to the ideal future, or we don't. And if we get to the ideal future, it's like the proverbial saying, tomorrow never comes, right? As soon as we get to the ideal future is immediately transformed back into the unbearable present. So it's still unbearable, even though we accomplished our goal, of course, and we wouldn't have accomplished the goal if we had known it would have been unbearable once we got there. So we kind of have this illusion that the future is going to be better than whatever it is that we have now. As soon as we get there, of course, we find out that it isn't. So we're stuck in this repetitive cycle of like suffering and like trying to escape it by enacting some plans towards the future. Anyway, so you can kind of see basically this cycle here in Buddhist psychology is called the wheel of samsara. And of course it's a wheel because it's just like a cycle. You suffer, you make some plans for the future, you enact those plans, you find success, you get a little dopamine burst, but then you're exactly, psychologically speaking, you're exactly where you were, which is unsatisfied. Okay, so this is the first noble truth, is just like life is unsatisfactory. The second noble truth, it talks about the cause, and the cause is really it's like fundamental to our human nature, but they call it like desire or craving. You could even say like addiction. And our desire, our craving, our addiction is, and we talked about this in Peterson's diagram, the craving, the desire is to have something better than whatever it is that we have now. So maybe you want a candy bar. Maybe you want to be divorced, but you're not. Maybe you want to have more money, but you don't. Maybe you wish your kid would behave, but they won't. Maybe you wish someone would clean your house, but that's not going to happen. So there's all these cravings for things that we want, that we don't have, right? All these different potential ideal futures that we can imagine, but we don't have. So it's really this craving, this desire that leads us into our unhappy state, our state of dukkha. So this is basically the first two noble truths. It's that life is suffering, life is unsatisfactory, and the cause of that unsatisfactoriness is essentially our craving, our wishful thinking that things would be different even though that they're not. And if you've ever heard any Buddhists or spiritual people giving talks about, fully accepting the present moment, this is the shortcut. This is the solution to this craving. It's like, stop craving. Just accept the present moment exactly how it is, unsatisfactory or not, and everything will be fine. Everything is fine. You just don't know that because you're kind of caught up in this narrative structure of the unbearable present and attempting to enact plans to get to the ideal future. If you could somehow escape that and just actually see the way that things are without trying to escape them or manipulate them or squeeze a little bit more happiness out of life, if you could just stop all of those activities of like trying to get somewhere, everything would open up and be beautiful and romantic and just really this is enlightenment essentially, is if you can stop hating the present moment and stop trying to escape it into the future, then everything's fine. And this is the beautiful thing, is like you don't have to do anything on the Buddhist path to quote unquote be happy or end your suffering. You just have to stop doing all these things that you're doing. You have to stop craving. Just stop suffering. It's like that. It's so easy. And that's the third noble truth. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. The third noble truth is called Nirodha, and this is basically the Buddha is pointing out that we can escape the cycle of the first two. We can escape this cycle of like the present moment always being unbearable and always having to enact some plans or behavioral patterns to escape that into the ideal future. The Buddha said, well, actually, you can just like extract yourself out of that situation completely and abide in what they call pure awareness or pure consciousness without being attached to objects or the narrative structure of your life. And you can just see for what it is, and you can be happy and peaceful all the time. It's kind of like a switch that goes off in your head, and instead of chasing after things, you're enjoying the journey. So the Nirodha, the cessation of suffering, is kind of like when we remind ourselves that life is about the journey, not the destination, right? It's okay that all of your needs are not satisfied right now. It's actually, maybe it's even more fun to go on a path and to seek answers for the questions rather than having no problems at all. So this is interesting. I think this probably goes beyond modern brain psychology. Like modern brain psychology, we've studied the hypothalamus and we know how the dopamine system works, and we know that people get caught in this loop of seeking pleasure. They get the dopamine burst. The dopamine kind of like reinforces the behavior, and then they're more likely to enact that behavior in the future. And so it's really easy to get kind of caught up in this neurological loop of seeking pleasure, receiving pleasure. As soon as you receive it, you're back in the unbearable present. So now you have to seek some new pleasure. Okay, so this huge cycle. The Buddha is saying this isn't the only way. This isn't the only way. This isn't the only way to do things. This isn't the only way to live your life. And the fourth noble truth is following up on the third one. Okay, that's great. We can stop suffering. How do we do that? Step 4, truth number 4, is called Magga, which means path. And the fourth noble truth is the path that will lead us away from suffering. Now, this is noble truth number 4. This is where it starts to get a little tricky, and I'm just going to mention something here, is that the Eightfold path, which is the fourth noble truth. The fourth noble truth is the path that leads us away from suffering and into enlightenment or nirvana or whatever you want to call it. The fourth noble truth is the path. And the path, I think the path as laid out by the Buddha was specifically intended for people of that culture. So the fourth noble truth, I am backtracking a little bit. So I think the first 3 are more or less universal, and I think the fourth one, the fourth truth, the path that the individual has to take is somewhat culturally dependent. Now, I'm still going to tell you the Eightfold Noble Path, which the Buddha preached, and then I'm probably going to just include some asterisks of like, this might not work for us now, and maybe offer some suggestions. So, I'm going to go ahead and jump into that now. I'm trying to keep this video a little shorter than my previous videos, and I'm talking pretty fast. I'm covering a lot of ground. So we're trying to keep it short. This was Buddhism in a nutshell, although it might be like 2 or 3 nutshells at this point. Okay, so the Eightfold Noble Path, the path that leads to nirvana, the cessation of dukkha, and eternal enlightenment. Step number 1 is called right view, and I think Peterson has done a great job of carrying this forward into the modern age and kind of breathing new life into it, but you need to really sort out your philosophical view. You need to get educated, you need to understand human psychology, you need to understand human nature, you need to understand how people operate in the world in a realistic way. Otherwise, the rest of the path, I mean, you're just going to get run over by other people. You're going to get taken advantage of. You're going to get flung off the path so easily. So you need to get your philosophical views straight. You need to straighten that out. This is kind of like when you have a cataract in your eye and you go get LASIK, right? When you have a cataract, literally everything in the world is distorted and you can't see it properly. You run into things, you're going to get hurt, you're susceptible to injuries, people could take advantage of you. So having the right view is like getting LASIK surgery or getting contact lenses, and all of a sudden you can just see things clearly. It doesn't mean you're enlightened, it doesn't mean you're any closer to the end of the path, but it means you can see clearly. It means you can see clearly the path that is in front of you. You can see clearly one foot in front of the other. What steps do you need to take to reach the goal? Okay, step number 2, and arguably these are interchangeable. This could have been step 1, but you need to have right resolve or right intention. And the cultural implications here were basically desire to follow the Buddhist path and placing yourself in a conducive environment for contemplation. And I think this is extremely important. Again, if you've done any kind of like self-help workshops or listened to, like David Goggins or Jordan Peterson or pretty much, anyone with a head on their shoulders is going to tell you, you need to get your intention straight. You need to know what you want. And for this path, we're kind of assuming that what you want is enlightenment. And if that is true, if you want your psychological suffering to end, then you need to have that intention. You need to set that intention despite the fact that you might not know exactly the steps that are necessary to take. So, and kind of the way that I explain it is that once you know what you want, once you're really, really certain of what your intentions are, what your heart wants the most at the deepest possible level, everything else starts to click into place. So as soon as you find your motivation, as soon as you know what you want, the path starts to become clear. It's pretty obvious once you know what you want that there are certain things in your life that you need to start pushing away, or certain things in your life that you're doing that you need to stop doing. And that only becomes clear once you have your goal firmly established. Okay. Part 3, aspect 3 of the Noble Eightfold Path is called right speech. Again, I think Peterson really nails this home with his explanation of the idea in Christian mythology of the Logos. And if you're like a Terence McKenna fan or anything like this, he talks about the Logos and the power of language as it has kind of made its way into human society. And this is an extremely powerful force, not only for the collective, for social institutions, and for reformations and revolutions and all this kind of thing. This is all great, but it's also extremely powerful for the individual to shape his life, his or her life, shape their environment, and so on. So right speech, there's kind of multiple levels to this, but I would say like at the most fundamental, at the most coarse-grained level is like stop intentionally lying and manipulating people. This will go a long way to delivering you out of suffering. You might think that your lies and your manipulations are actually benefiting you in some way, but as Peterson would say, the other shoe has not yet fallen. You're probably not taking into account some of the unintended consequences of telling those lies, psychological and external. When you lie to people a lot, or when you're misleading them, or when you're not being truthful with your speech, basically one of the fundamental problems is that you tend to believe your own lies. You're not actually smart enough to get away with lying to someone else without believing it yourself. So maybe you tell someone a lie, and then you have to excuse that lie or come up with a justification for that lie to, maybe the lie doesn't fully check out, so you have to make up another lie. And then to defend these two lies, you have to make up another lie, and then all of a sudden you're kind of embedded in this huge fake story that you've created for yourself, and it's extremely difficult to get out of these situations. In fact, some people are so embedded in their own network of lies and the lies of other people around them that tolerate this kind of thing that it just ruins their life. Like, their life is over after that. Very, very psychologically dangerous to get into situations where you cannot tell the truth. You're just susceptible to all sorts of pathologies. And like I said, Peterson is extremely good at explaining this aspect. So maybe I'll put a link in the description or something if you want to know why you should tell the truth, or what can happen if you don't tell the truth, or what can happen when societies at large forfeit their relationship with the truth or with the Logos. I can direct you to some of that information. Very, very interesting, very, very profound and enlightening. Handle with your own care, right? I mean, being exposed to some of Peterson's work can really knock you off your feet. Unless you're really intellectually sturdy already, it can knock you off your feet. Although I would say it knocked me off my feet, and then I got back up a lot stronger. So if you're kind of ready to get donkey punched right in the face by some hardcore truth, Jordan Peterson's the man to go to. But brace yourself. Okay, aspect 4 of the Eightfold Path is called right conduct, or right action. And of course, this is going to be universal. This is abstaining from killing, abstaining from stealing, taking things without asking, just general, like 10 Commandments stuff, like don't kill, don't be an adulteress, don't steal your neighbor's goat, this kind of thing. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but morally acceptable conduct will get you a long way. Again, this won't deliver you to enlightenment, but it will certainly remove obstacles. If you're constantly stealing and killing people and and involving yourself in sexual situations with people you shouldn't, it's very unlikely that you're going to reach the end goal. So if you stop doing these things, you're just going to get out of your own way, essentially. Aspect number 5 of the Noble Eightfold Path is called right livelihood. And this one I'm going to talk about a little bit, because in the Buddhist and the Hindu world, this essentially means begging for your food, becoming a monk, giving up all of your worldly possessions, leaving your home in search of a monastery and a teacher. And so right livelihood is perhaps not applicable, or rather not even possible for most people in a modern, postmodern society. An acceptable replacement to that would be your employment, the job that you do, the way that you generate your own livelihood for yourself and maybe your family, and maybe even your extended network of friends. How do you carry yourself through your day? How do you balance your finances? This can go a long way towards strengthening yourself, shaping yourself up, and it also has residual effects on society. So if you are doing work that you know you shouldn't be doing, I think that's a good way to put it. There are certain things that you're doing with your time, with your effort, that you know are not helpful. They're not helpful to you. They're not helpful to your spouse. They're not helpful to your kids. They're not even helpful to the employer who thinks he wants the stuff done. They're not helpful to the economy. They're not helpful to the political situation. They're not helpful to the society at large. You should probably stop doing those things, in other words. And basically, this is just giving you permission to walk away from that. I mean, there's so many problems in society today that, just saying bullshit and walking away from some of this is, it goes a long way. So if you have to spend 8 hours a day doing something, you might as well do something a little, productive. So maybe you could equilibrate your job slightly better than it is now. And so instead of just bringing home a paycheck, maybe you can find a way to bring home a paycheck and actually do some good for yourself or for society, or maybe you could put yourself in a position that would allow you to acquire some new skills that would be helpful in the future. So in terms of right livelihood, in terms of the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, I would say just try and find a higher state of balance. Try and be a little more inclusive in the scope of what you find to be acceptable work. But again, the whole leaving home, giving up your material possessions, and taking a vow of poverty, I don't think this is necessary or even possible in today's society. So the original definition of right livelihood is perhaps insufficient. Okay, the 6th aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path is right effort. And right effort has a pretty specific meaning. It's kind of like a technical term, but it basically means eliminating negative states of mind and fostering positive states of mind. And again, this kind of goes back to the self-help genre, the self-help industry, and in particular, like the people who talk about subjective reality. How are you interpreting reality? What kind of stories are you telling yourself that may or may not be true? One of the goals of Buddhist practice is to eradicate negative states of mind, eradicate negative self-thought and negative thoughts about the world, kind of like these apocalyptic conspiracy theory, like all of this nonsense that probably isn't true anyways. We're just gonna say bullshit. We're just gonna walk away, and we're gonna try and find a way to foster positive states of mind. We're going to look at our lives in the context of a narrative, a story that has a positive ending. The one thing Timothy Leary said is, you should picture the world as a conspiracy of a very small number of powerful people. Of course, you and your friends are those powerful people, right? If you have a loser's scenario, you should write a new script for your life. You don't need this kind of crap that's just like you're a consumer, you're a cog in the machine, and you just go to college and get a job and waste the most productive years of your life just cranking away for the machine. Okay, this is all a story, and it's really, really bad story. It's a toxic story. We need a better story. We need a way better story. If you're looking for a better story, of course, the religious people have something to offer, although it's still a bit apocalyptic. I love Elon Musk because he's got a great story. He likes doing work that is profitable and valuable, but also is carrying society towards a better future. And I think any story that we're going to tell ourselves needs to include that end result of there's going to be a better future. So right effort towards eliminating these negative thought patterns, these negative habits, and trying to establish some more positive habits. Okay, aspect number 7 in the Eightfold Path is called right mindfulness. And mindfulness, again, this is a technical term in Buddhist philosophy and psychology, but it's actually pretty easy to cultivate. In other words, you can be mindful right now if you simply redirect your attention from out there, looking outwards, and instead you just reorient towards the internal senses. How do you feel right now? What is it like to be aware and conscious of the things that you're conscious of? So I think in modern psychology they have this term which is interoception, and it's kind of our own sense of what's going on inside of our body and how our body feels as it's moving through space. It's almost like a sixth sense. So we have our 5 ordinary senses, and then the Buddhists would say, well, you also have this sensory perception of what's going on inside your body. And so we're kind of working on cultivating that and strengthening that sense. Very much like we can train our eyes to see things more acutely by practicing, we can also increase our ability to sense what's going on inside of our bodies and our own psychological state by continually redirecting our attention to that and just practicing it, basically. So we can really become more mindful of how we feel, and that's going to help us with all of the other aspects of this path, and also it's going to help us with meditation, which is essentially the 8th point on this list, which we're about to get to. So mindfulness can be very powerful, and a lot of times if you're in a bad situation and you become mindful and you kind of like switch your perceptions from looking outside to looking inside, it can really just change things like pretty immediately towards something a little more positive. You can say, oh, I don't have to give my attention away to this political person on the television or all the crazy stuff going on Fox News. Oh, I can just ignore that and like, oh, actually today's a pretty good day and I feel kind of nice today. So sometimes it can really just change our outlook just like that. The real task is to work on sustaining that for long periods of time and then eventually sustain it indefinitely. We're just, like I said, we're trying to eliminate these negative modes of thought and these negative outlooks on life that don't lead anywhere but more suffering. Okay, so the 8th and final element to the Noble Eightfold Path is called right samadhi. Samadhi, of course, is an Indian word, and it means it's a technical term for being in a very deep state of meditative absorption. Specifically, I believe samadhi is being conscious, being aware, but not being aware or conscious of any object. So rather, it's just a pure state of awareness and consciousness that is not necessarily absorbed in thinking, in thoughts, or in contemplating objects. So it's possible you've stumbled into this state accidentally, but the Buddhist path is like trying to build up our mental capacity to enter that state on command. But the state is kind of like, let's see, if you maybe like when you first wake up, sometimes, not everyone, or maybe like right before you go to sleep, and your mind is lucidly aware of what's going on, but it's not necessarily distracted by thoughts. It's not uncomfortable, and it's not pleasurable. It's just like a pure awareness. Simply being aware of the fact that you're aware. It's consciousness being conscious of itself rather than being conscious of an object. So this is a really fascinating state of mind, and there's been some really interesting neuroscience studies on this in the past few years. If you're interested in that, you can look up Daniel P. Brown. He's doing some research at Harvard Medical School. And let's see, Jed Brewer is also doing a lot of interesting meditation studies. And they've been able to look at like what parts of the brain are active or inactive when people are in these really deep states of concentration when they're meditating. And it turns out that the results are really interesting. And they actually the neuroscience studies tend to line up with what we know about Buddhism and psychology generally, and kind of confirms the Buddhist rumors. But I'm not going to go into that. I'll link that in the description. Both of those folks are really great researchers. I'm sure there's some more research going on in the field, but that's not really the point of this video. I would love to talk about that, and I've got some interesting opinions on that, and maybe we can go into that later. Okay, that's pretty much all I've got to say. We talked about the Four Noble Truths, so I'll just recap that. The Four Noble Truths are dukkha, which is suffering or the unsatisfactory nature of life, right? Life's a bitch. Number 2 is the cause of suffering, the cause of dukkha. And the cause, per Buddha's observation, is desiring, craving, addiction towards things that are pleasurable. And simply by the fact that we can't always be in a state of pleasure leads us to feel that somehow the world is unacceptable, unsatisfactory, brings us suffering. Truth number three is nirodha, which is the fact or the observation that this cycle of suffering and seeking pleasure you can extract yourself from that. And number 4, the fourth truth, broadly speaking, is that the way you extract yourself from that cyclic pattern of seeking pleasure and suffering is something like a contemplative path. Something like this eightfold path that I've just laid out. Straightening out your philosophical view, setting your intentions and getting your resolve straightened out, stop lying, telling the truth, getting your speech in order, conducting yourself in moral ways, abstaining from killing, stealing, and raping people, having livelihood that is meaningful and productive, working towards eliminating negative states of mind and fostering positive states of mind, being mindful of how you feel at every moment, and being more aware and mindful of how your actions lead to suffering or lead away from suffering. And then, of course, the last bit of that is samadhi, concentration, meditation. Of course, it's only mentioned at point number 8, but if you know anything about Buddhism on the surface, it's like, this is kind of the one that people zoom in on the most, is like, all you have to do is meditate and you'll be enlightened. Okay. Turns out that's not true. That's one aspect of a multi-dimensional path that is designed to loosen the hold that suffering has on our daily lives. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Sorry it didn't turn out to be Buddhism in a nutshell. It's still a nutshell in my view. Sometimes these things can go on a lot longer, but I tried to keep it short. I tried to give you sufficient detail and explanations and examples for all of these so that hopefully you've gleaned something valuable. I'm going to turn the video off now, but I would love to hear comments or suggestions or questions if anyone has them. Thanks.